What's up, everyone at MEET DELIC? My name is Jason Silva. I'm so sorry I can't be with you guys in person, but through the magic of information technology, which is itself psychedelic, I am beaming this transmission from across the world to share my vision of the future of psychedelics and healing. Now, where does this begin for me, my friends? Well, this of course begins with my interest in alleviating human suffering. This begins with a desire to understand the existential weight of our traumas, my desire to mend our broken psyches, because the mental health epidemic, friends, is real, and it is inconceivable to me that we don't declare this a public health emergency. According to the World Health Organization, and this is an astonishing figure, around 800,000 people a year now are committing suicide. That is a larger number than the amount of people that die from armed conflict and natural disasters combined. So that means that our own psyches, our own minds, are more dangerous to our lives than natural disasters and armed conflict. Now, of course, climate change is an emergency, and of course we want to do our best to end wars and violent conflict across the world. But we really need to address this mental health epidemic that is causing so many people to take their lives. The status quo, friends, isn't working anymore. And it's not just those that have taken their lives. It is all of us who suffer under the weight of anxiety, of depression, of post-traumatic stress disorder. It is all of us that are carrying the scars of trauma and that are too ashamed and feel so impotent we know not what to do. We need new answers, and we also need better questions. And this is really where psychedelics are potentially so game-changing, right? Psychedelics, psychoactive compounds, they seem to provide a unique intervention that literally transforms us from within. And how this works, of course, is the most interesting story of our age. As we live through this psychedelic renaissance, and as more and more people start to kind of join the train that's left the station, it's more important than ever to understand how psychedelics do what they do, why they do what they do, and then of course imagine how we might deploy these tools in conjunction with other ecstatic and psychoactive technologies to create spaces of healing and transformation that reinvigorate and upend the human condition. It's not just about healing our fractures, but also, as Michael Pollan says, about making well people better. And so on this note, let us begin the story of psychedelics. My name is Jason Silva. Let's get into it. So the most interesting thing, of course, about psychedelics is the fact that under controlled environments, with the right guardrails, with the right psychotherapists in the room, with the right protocols and procedures, they have an astonishing capacity to heal. We're talking people with treatment-resistant depression, people with treatment-resistant anxiety, people with obsessive-compulsive disorder that hasn't responded to any traditional treatment, finding absolution, being literally cured of their pathology by a handful of psychedelic sessions. Now, how exactly does this work? Well, I'm particularly persuaded by the words of Robin Carhart Harris. He's probably at this event, and he used to be at the Imperial College of London. He's a neuroscientist who's achieved great fame for his cutting-edge research on psychedelics. He coined what I think is a compelling theory of mental illness called the entropic brain theory. Why the entropic brain theory? Well, basically he says that the worm at the core, or rather the root of all mental distress, right, whether it's depression, anxiety, OCD, PTSD, and others, all of them actually originate in the same dysfunction, which is excessive rumination, a brain that has essentially become too ordered. See, unlike manic depression or schizophrenia, which are pathologies of brain disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, PTSD, anxiety, and depression actually stem from an excessively ordered brain. A brain that has become hyper-vigilant. A brain that has metastasized and given rise to an ego that has turned into a tyrant. That's the version of us that on the other side of trauma has grown so hyper-vigilant that we live inside of these patterns of thinking, this kind of locked-in syndrome of distress, that we're either playing back recurring stories of depression and or anxiety, obsessing with this excessive rumination and self-conscious, these locked-in patterns of thinking that we can't seem to transcend or escape, right? And so what's interesting then about this entropic brain theory is that psychedelics can address all of these mental pathologies because of the mechanism of action of psychedelics, which is incredibly compelling. So here's how they work. For those of us that are stuck in the rut of obsessive thinking, of excessive rumination and self-consciousness, think of it as like, I think Robin Carhart Harris explains it like a ski mountain. And there's all these ski routes down the mountain, and they're like the popular routes, and everybody's skiing down the same routes. And after a while, these ski routes, they get like grooved like tire tracks, and everybody, like the patterns in our thinking, everybody takes the same way down all the time. And for those of us locked in by patterns of thinking related to trauma, we keep thinking the same thoughts. We get stuck in the same loops. We're trapped in these stories that no longer serve us, right? As a definition I once read about a personal crisis begins when the story you tell yourself about yourself is no longer convincing, because human beings were storytelling animals. Our sense of meaning and signification and mental health is sustained by a personal narrative, a story that tells us who we are, a mytho-poetic story that sort of is aligned with our biographical reality, a sense of meaning. But when that story goes awry, when we get locked into patterns of thinking and self-defeating narratives, we're like stuck inside these lenses of perception. And psychedelics, essentially, as Robin Carhart Harris has said, they shake the snow globe, right? And so in shaking the snow globe, you create a kind of tabula rasa, what he calls a pivotal mental state of increased suggestibility and receptivity, whereby you can go in and do some serious meta-programming of the human operating system. You can craft a new story, a phoenix that rises from the ashes. Of course, this experience of shaking the snow globe and opening up a space where we can go in and intervene and craft a new story is what's known as happening in the space of what's called ego death, or a mystical experience, right? These are subjective accounts of what it feels like to die to your story and to create a new story. But at the level of what you might call mechanism of action, psychedelics do this, of course, by engaging the serotonin 2A receptor and so on and so forth, and dissolving temporarily something called the default mode network, which is where you might call the seat of the soul or the autobiographical mind. The ruminating part of the neocortex, the default mode network, is what has become overly active and overly ordered in people who are traumatized. And in temporarily shutting this down, this physical mechanism of action, psychedelics provide finally a place to rewrite that story. And with the right guardrails, and with the right interventions, and with the right therapists, and perhaps with the right music, with the right tools, that pivotal mental state is a unique opportunity to forge a new sense of self, to forge a new story. And this is hugely important, but it's important on two levels. On the one hand, it's important to understand the physical mechanism of action, to understand the science, to understand the thing we can measure in clinical trials. But on the other hand, it's interesting to speculate about the content of these experiences. What happens inside of us? How does this transformation play out inside the waking dream that is a psychedelic trip? And how do we interpret and integrate these trips psychologically, right? Ursula Le Guin, famous author, she said it best. She said, "Science describes accurately from the outside, and poetry describes accurately from the inside. Science explicates and poetry implicates. It's like church and state. We need the science. We need to understand the mechanism of action. We need to ground these medicines in a quantifiable reality that we can test in a lab. But we also need poetry and art and music, right? We also need interpretations for the interior experience that defines the human condition and be able to map those spaces as well. And that happens to be a big passion of mine. I need to find that intersecting point between physical mechanism of action and mythopoetic reality, right? The consensus world that we live in and the mythopoetic truth beyond the literal grid where the human soul resides. And it is at this intersection that my work comes most alive. And so, again, it's all about mechanism of action, understanding the science, but also having the tools to map those domains psychologically. How we heal from our trauma is as much a story as it is a physical mechanism of action that says, oh yeah, okay, so he no longer meets the criteria for depression or anxiety because his serotonin levels are balanced once more, and so on and so forth. And that really, my friends, is what it's all about. So now what I'd like to do is show you a video that attempts to map the ineffability of the psychological experience of ego death, right? Because now that we understand the mechanism of action, shaking the snow globe, temporarily shutting down the default mode network, and all that jazz and all that scientific jargon, let's show you the poetry. Let's show you the song from the inside of what it's like to die to who you were, cleanse your lenses of perception, experience resurrection, and break on through to the other side. This, friends, is a video on ego death. Enjoy. Let's talk a little bit about experiences of ritualized surrender, right? Psychologists often tell us that it is in the act of letting go that you find out who you are. The prospect of ego death, however, the prospect of any kind of ritualized surrender feels like dying, but only to those who resist it. Those who eventually come to realize that there is no such thing as death, at least that psychological dying into the moment is but an illusion, the last hurrah, the last resistance before you hurl yourself into the abyss and realize that it's a featherbed. You know, Terence McKenna talked about this. He said, this is the secret. This is what all the shamans, the professors, the wise men, this is what they understood. This is the alchemical goal. This is how magic is done. You hurl yourself into the abyss and you realize that it's a featherbed. Our society today is constructed, we know this, in a way where many people are afflicted with a pathological amount of anxiety and depression. It's what Jamie Wheal calls 21st century normal, this fibrillating, anxious state from an overactive ego stemming from a misfiring default mode network, which is the autobiographical mind, which is essentially metastasized into something that is a kind of autoimmune disorder of the self. And the excessive rumination and self-consciousness that characterizes depression and anxiety both come from a mind that has become too ordered, too rigid, too hyper-vigilant. It's like we're all living with a perpetual micro PTSD. And what the research tells us, and this has informed so much of my creative life, what the research now tells us is that in safe containers and with the proper precautions deployed, the experience of ecstatic surrender, the experience of ego death, what Jamie Wheal calls the bliss fuck crucifixion, is actually where all the healing is done, right? It is when you die into the moment that you realize that all your fears are unfounded. You come to see that everything you want is on the other side of fear, right? It's like that David Fincher movie, The Game, reveals to us in that line that says, quoting the Bible, John chapter 12, verse something, whereas once I was blind, now I can see. It is hard to put language to these instances of ecstatic surrender, right? Hurling yourself into the abyss and realizing that it's a featherbed arrives you at a domain that exists outside of time. The self experiences this as liberation from the incessant inner chatter. We are free to be ourselves. We become infinite is what it feels like. Transitory enchanted moments in which we hold our breath, compelled into aesthetic contemplations we neither understand nor perhaps even desired, face to face with something commensurate to our capacity for wonder. We experience afresh the hardly bearable ecstasy of direct energy exploding in our nerve endings. We recontextualize the self as a marvelous conduit in a timeless whole from which molecules and meanings flow from neurons to nebula and back again. We see the world in a grain of sand, and we see heaven in a wild flower. We hold infinity in the palms of our hand. We hold eternity in an hour. And then the moment will pass. And all contradictions are reconciled. Man has surpassed the gods. And what do we find after these enchanted moments? What do we find after these moments of opiated adjacency? When we spill over, when we overflow, when we are cracked open so that the light gets in. We find that people report increased feelings of well-being in their baseline reality, increased feelings of compassion, increased feelings of creativity, increased feelings of joy, a sense of having glimpsed noetic truth, a sense of having tapped into the infinite, a feeling of communion with the cosmos. An ontological awakening, a spiritual experience, a forceful reckoning with what is, a mainlining of space and time through the optic nerve. We become what we behold, and we behold the infinite. Miguel de Unamuno wrote in Tragic Sense of Life, eternity, eternity, nothing is real that is not eternal. So the question remains, right? We know the way, we know the path, we know what we must do to heal ourselves. How might we turn our passing illuminations into abiding light? How might we turn our self-systems from leaky buckets, right, colanders full of holes, into chalices, said Jamie Wheel. How might we render ourselves whole? How might we render ourselves holy? This has become the central preoccupation of my life.
All right, now, it should be noted that I am an artist, and so my account of the inside of a psychological ego death, like what a psychological ego death feels like from the inside, takes the poetic license that an artist always takes. So take it with a grain of salt. That is my poetry, that is my song, that is my attempt to language the ineffable. So much of what happens in psychedelic space and so much of what we might call psychological healing is a highly personal experience. We all have different narratives. We all have a different story about who we are. We all have different belief systems. We all have different superstitions. We all have a different meaning-making process. And so it is my view that we must be clear about the distinction between what's true for us and what's empirically or objectively real. This is part of the paradox of psychedelics, that we're trying to map in a lab and quantify the healing effects of an experience that itself seems like it exceeds the literal grid. You know, when people have a mystical experience on psychedelics, they feel like they transcend their bodies. They have an out-of-body experience. They connect with the eternal. They have a bleed-through effect where they feel like they go through wormholes and transcend space and time and see the divine and engage with Pachamama or Jesus or Buddha or whatever interpretive framework they have. And so here you have a felt experience that feels like it is metaphysical, and a world that asks us to map this quantifiably, because we have to pass it through phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials. We need to meet the criteria of the Food and Drug Administration and so on and so forth. And so what I would say is I would echo the words of Chris Letheby. Chris Letheby is a natural philosopher out of Australia who basically says that the content of the psychedelic experience, the highly personalized interiority of a psychedelic experience, is like church. And the epistemic effects, the thing that we can measure in the world, are you better? Do you no longer meet the criteria for depression? Do you no longer meet the criteria for anxiety? Those epistemic values are like state. So we should separate church and state. When you have a psychedelic experience and you craft and disclose new psychological truths about yourself that heal you, that's for you. That's not scripture, nor should it be doctrine. That's your poetry. That's what you journal. That's what you integrate and talk to your family about. That's the highly personal, mythopoetic interiority. That is your psychology. That's your church. And you should be free to interpret the trip in the same way that you are free to worship as you wish. But the state, but the science, but the epistemic value, but the thing we measure when we pass through clinical trials to legalize these substances and make these practices and protocols available, that just has to be, do you feel better? Do you no longer meet the criteria for depression? Are you serving your community? Is your suicidal ideation gone? If those things are true, then psychedelics pass the test. Now, if you're still grappling with the fact that you were like hovering through time and space and you felt yourself dissolve into molecules, hey man, write a poem, right? Write a journal entry, make a song, make an art film, show me what it was like for you, right? That's the role of art. That's the role of artists, right? As to reflect our historical drive to manifest our interiority or our consciousness outside of our mind in front of our eyes. And so my invitation to this audience as we move into this psychedelic renaissance and we work so intensely to try to legalize these compounds and make them accessible for others is let's keep church and state separately. Right? Let's not make any great statements about the interior psychological experience. Let us not take our own psychology and our own interpretation and turn that into scripture. Let us not turn this into a cult. Let us not celebrate false gods and false idols. Let us not have ego inflation where we think because we experienced a powerful ego death that now we know the answer that everyone else should follow. That's how we corrupt the psychedelic revolution. The magic of your psychological experience, take your broken heart and turn it into art. Take that healing and turn it into art. But what we measure in the lab, the case we make to governments across the world, the harm reduction and the power of this revolution to alleviate suffering, that should be measured in ways that everybody can agree on. That's consensus reality. No more suicidal ideation, no more PTSD, no more depression, no more anxiety, an ability to function in the world, an ability to contribute to our community. If it meets all those criteria, then this psychedelic revolution is here to stay. Okay, friends? The human condition is no small picnic. We're all bearing the load of being finite beings craving immortality, right? The explicit awareness that we're breathing pieces of defecating meat destined to die and potentially no more significant than a lizard or a potato, as Sheldon Solomon says, is no easy picnic. We must craft new interpretive frameworks that serve us, but we still cannot deny the reality of being mortal beings. So the human condition in itself causes a kind of micro PTSD, and perhaps psychedelics are the tools that allow us to live with equanimity and grace in spite of this horrendous imposition called mortality. Perhaps they are tools that endow us with grace and fill us with faith, two things with which, without, I don't know if we can live, right? They say that human beings can live for a couple days without food and water, but we can't even live for a minute without hope. And perhaps the vision of these psychedelic experiences can fill us with the kind of hope that carries over into our everyday lives. What we see on those peaks, we can bring back into the valleys and help our community and plant seeds and serve others and show up and grow up and get to work. And so that's the contemporary state of psychedelics. And that's really something I'm immensely passionate about. And so in summation of the human condition and the importance of these tools, here's a beautiful video animated with some oil paintings about what it means to be human and how delicate it is to be aware that we're aware. Watch.
Human beings find themselves in quite the predicament. We have the mental capacity to ponder the infinite, seemingly capable of anything. Yet we're housed in these heart-pumping, breath-gasping, decaying bodies. simultaneously gods and worms. Human beings exist at the interplay between the finite and the infinite. The explicit awareness that you're a breathing piece of defecating meat destined to die, ultimately no more significant than a lizard or a potato, is not especially uplifting. We are the only being in the animal kingdom that can contemplate its own death. So it's not just that we're running away from immediate predators, but that even if everything's awesome, we lose sleep over the fact that one day we will die. One day the sun will eclipse and burn the earth. One day it's all gonna end. But the existential bummer is that we are uniquely aware. The first and most impactful solution to the death problem was the virtual reality known as religion. It absolves us of our fear because guess what? You'll live forever in the kingdom of God. The second solution to the problem of death is romantic love, the deification of the other. The third solution to the problem of death, perhaps the most interesting one, the creative solution to the problem of death. What can we build? What can we do? What can we create together to overcome, to transcend, to redefine our boundaries, to expand the perimeters of the possible, to overcome our limits, to put things together in a certain way in which things become transcendent?
All right, so I'd also like to say a few words about psychedelics as teaching tools, right? How exactly is it that what you might call psychedelic knowledge, the insights that emerge or are disclosed in a psychedelic state, these flashes of revelation, how exactly does that work? And why is it that these flashes of revelation can get through, right, can be downloaded into our minds, hearts, and bodies in ways that conventional knowledge seemingly cannot? And for this, I turn back to Mr. Chris Letheby, psychedelic naturalist out of Australia. So he talks, of course, about the infamous lenses of perception, echoing Aldous Huxley's famous writing in The Doors of Perception. So Chris says we have these lenses of perception, and these lenses of perception are interpretive frameworks. They are the augmented reality that we deploy upon the world to make sense of that world. And those lenses of perception are shaped by our past history, our biographical reality, our cultural upbringing, the set of experiences throughout our lives that have created these maps of meaning and interpretation that we use to read with, right? To read the world with. And the interesting thing about these lenses is they're so ever-present that we forget we're wearing them, right? Like that's what's really the most compelling thing. We see with these lenses and we see through these lenses, but we're not aware we're wearing the lenses. We don't see the lenses themselves. So think about how potentially problematic this is. To see with those lenses and through those lenses, but not be self-aware enough to know that we're wearing lenses, means that when trauma happens to us, that when really bad things happen to us, when the involuntary killings of the ego and humiliation and the circumstances and tragedy of life happens to us, that affects our interpretive frameworks. It affects our maps. It colors our lenses. It makes our lenses go black. And so now this trauma makes it so that everywhere we look, we see danger. Everywhere we look, it triggers hypervigilance. Everywhere we look, we think everybody is distrustful, right? Because of our past trauma. The problem is, just because something bad happened in the past doesn't think it's automatically going to happen in the present or in the future. The nature of trauma, as David Lenson says, is that it's a kind of temporal dislocation. The past trauma becomes the lenses that you bring to the doorstep of every moment. And so what happens is you bring the past to the present, you overread or misread what's happening now, you overdetermine the present, and immediately conjure up a future that becomes identified with death, and you can feel it like a fist in the stomach. And so the problem is when you're stuck wearing these lenses that are no longer serving you, Chris Letheby says, you need an experience of what he calls knowledge by acquaintance. Enter psychedelics. Because knowledge by description just won't work. The pit of despair, of anxiety and depression and OCD is that which is a space in which language doesn't serve, language doesn't reach. I can try to pull you out of that dark hole by promising you a world on the other side of transformation, but knowledge by description simply will not get through. You're too guarded, you're too locked up, you're too locked in. But psychedelic experiences evoke, again, as Robin Carhart Harris has said, these pivotal mental states. And when you're highly open and highly suggestible, instead of knowledge by description, you are shown knowledge by acquaintance. Knowledge that hits in the stomach, in the heart, and in the mind. It hits somatically. They call it somatic healing. It's not just content that's cognitive, it's content that is in the body and in the soul and in the psyche. And so this knowledge by acquaintance is the metaphorical equivalent of taking you out of that black hole and helicoptering you to the top of Mount Everest at sunrise while listening to Hans Zimmer as you are moved to the point of tears and you kiss the one you love. You are shown the light. Even the Bible said, whereas once I was blind, now I can see. It is these flashes of illumination that seem to really make a deep shift in our psyches and souls. It is these flashes of illumination of what the Greeks call catalepsis, a truth from which nothing can dislodge you, that seem to lead to the lasting transformation of psychedelics. And so again, psychedelics teach psychologically through these interpretations that are disclosed when the lenses of perception that you see through and that you see with become readily apparent. Like, I was seeing the world through that lens, but now I can see the lens, and that lens is scratched and broken, and it's shaped by what happened in the past, and now I know that to be true. So now I can dispense of that lens, and I can buy a new pair of sunglasses, a new pair of lenses of perception, a new set of interpretive frameworks, new poetry, new inspirational quotes, a new life mission, a new map for my future. And now I can bring that instead to the doorstep of every moment thanks to an experience of what you might call inverse PTSD, right? The trauma that gave you the darkness has now been has been absolved by an experience of such radiance and beauty, truth, freedom, and love that I am no longer the same. I am better. I am cured. And that, my friends, is knowledge by acquaintance. And that, my friends, is how psychedelics teach and how psychedelics heal. Okay, my friends at MEET DELIC, thank you for taking this trip with me. Thank you for taking this journey with me as we map the domains of psychedelics and map where we're currently at in this wonderful renaissance. Now I'd like to speculate a little bit about the future of psychedelics, as I am also a futurist and I think a lot about psychoactive technologies, right? We are all, I think, ecstatic technicians of the sacred now. We're all increasingly having the capacity to DJ our own subjectivity, to engage the technical material of subjectivity itself, as Eric Davis says, because that evanescent flux of sensation and perception that he writes is all we have and all we are, is increasingly being able to be stewarded. As David Lenson says, true liberation is stewardship of internal life. And we have the ecstatic technologies and interventions, and we have new exotic technologies that are emerging that will allow us to share spaces and places of what you might call intersubjectivity that are also really compelling. Let's talk about virtual reality, or rather, the reality of the virtual. Because as I've mentioned before, the way we see the world is a virtual reality, right? It's a compelling meta-narrative that we deploy upon the world like a kind of augmented reality. So everything from language to identity is a virtual reality, but that doesn't mean it's fundamentally unreal. The dream is real when you're in it, right? If you believe it to be true, it becomes true. And when we join forces, right, you could say that we scale the reality of this dream. A dream you dream alone is just a dream, but a dream you dream together is reality. And so virtual reality as an actual immersive technology mediated by digital tech is really exciting, because As Terence McKenna, the psychedelic philosopher, wrote, right now, if I want to show you my soul or show you my psyche, all I can really do is make a painting or a film or a video or bring you into my room so you see my books and my bed and my pillow and my teddy bears, right? I can show you artifacts that are intimations of my inner life. But that's fundamentally low resolution. As Flaubert says, even human speech is like a cracked kettle on which we tap crude rhythms while we long to make music that will melt the stars. So how can I show you the music I have inside of me that longs to melt the stars? Well, this is where virtual reality potentially becomes interesting, because its full flourishing might become something on the level of Neo in the Matrix, where you follow the white rabbit in fully immersive virtual spaces that are as real as our incarnated reality. But in those spaces, we could turn our minds inside out. Terence McKenna says, intimacy will be when I can invite you into my mind, not just into my room. So when two people want to connect, they could show each other's souls to one another, potentially with brain-machine interfaces while tripping on psychedelics mediated by virtual reality. Now I'm geeking out here, but try to imagine what it must be like to show the universe inside of you to somebody else. To hover and float through galaxies of your own making inside what you might call soul space or inner space with somebody else. It would be true intersubjectivity. It would be two souls becoming one. It would be a shared mental space, a cosmology of two, a shared interiority where your insides and my insides could finally become one. I, for one, am very excited to see what this might look like, and I hope that I've inspired you, not just with my tall tale of the current state of things when it comes to psychedelics, but also to invite you of what new exotic interventions we could potentially deploy to steward our minds to places and spaces of what we might call paradise engineering, in the words of David Pierce. Let us paradise engineer a world powered by MDMA-like consciousness, fueled by psilocybin-like ego death, inspired by cannabis-like virginal noticing and sense of first sight unencumbered by knowingness, as Michael Pollan says. Let us combine all of these psychoactive subjectivities and render a place of mind and meaning where we become art, where we become poetry, where we become awe, where our waking state is one of such perceptual expansion that we become like Jodie Foster at the end of the movie Contact, when she gets slingshotted through the wormhole, witnesses a celestial event, gets tears in her eyes and says, "They should have sent a poet. They should have sent a poet. They should have sent a poet." Thank you, MEET DELIC. I'm Jason Silva. Wish you a beautiful day.